I welcome everyone to the Understanding Risk Symposium 2020. Today we're coming to you with the last dialogue session of URBC 2020. These are essentially our version of an online keynote panel. Today's being titled Resilient Infrastructure in the Age of the Anthropocene. And we have an esteemed panel. Kristy will introduce them a little bit later on. I myself am a member of the Understanding Risk Organizing Committee and have been since we started hosting these symposiums in 2017. So I've had the pleasure of working with my colleague Susanna, who's led on the engagement components, and I've been leading on the program development components. Huge thank you to our sponsors this year, without which this program would not be possible. And especially, we've always tried to keep the entry to the symposium low barrier, so we can encourage a broad cross spectrum of people attending. So Natural Resources Canada, the Canadian Safety and Security Program, the Insurance Bureau of Canada, the BC Government Office of Housing and Construction Standards, as well as the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute of British Columbia, the BC Real Estate Association, and EGBC are sponsors this year. So huge thank you to them. And just a little bit of contextualization about URBC. The way I like to describe this is that we try to enhance connections across the science policy action interface. And it's basically an effort to implement the Sendai framework in British Columbia. So the Sendai framework is a global framework for disaster risk reduction to which Canada and British Columbia are signatories. BC became a signatory in 2018. And essentially what we're trying to do is implement this at regional and provincial scales through these symposiums that foster the all of society approach that Sendai talks about. This diagram on the right is another way of describing the science policy action interface. And so the main components of what we're trying to do through these sessions in terms of understanding the risk, looking at different mitigation options and their effectiveness, and then increasing the capacities and incentives to incorporate those strategies into planning and policy development at those local and regional scales. I'm going to pass it over to our moderator for this session, Kristy McConnell. Kristy is a planner with Mott MacDonald and works on a diversity of projects in sustainability and transportation. She's recently awarded PIBC's Award for Individual Achievement for Young Professional Leadership. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Kristy to moderate the session.
So thanks again, Jessica, for the introduction, and thanks very much to everybody who is joining us today. It's really my pleasure to be moderating today's session. So we are here this afternoon to discuss infrastructure resilience in what is really a time of unprecedented change. We're going to be focusing on both the why and the how of building and enhancing resilience in our communities, again, with a specific focus on the role of infrastructure. Collectively, we are facing no shortage of challenges in Southwest BC. In addition to social challenges that we can't ignore, like affordability and health challenges, we're up against a wide range of environmental and infrastructure challenges. Our infrastructure and civic facilities are aging in many cases, and we're facing ongoing risk of physical impacts and really cascading consequences of high impact disaster events in the region, with risks like seismic, flood, and other climate change risks. So the reality is that infrastructure comprises what is a complex network of inextricably linked components, which presents a challenge in and of itself. The linkages and the sheer scale of infrastructure make building its resilience a challenge that really demands our collective innovation and collaboration. So as we discuss infrastructure resilience, it is of course important to acknowledge both the complexity of these networks as well as the multi-hazard risk context we're working within. However, we do want to focus the majority of today's discussion on solutions rather than challenges. So we have a great lineup of panelists with this in mind who are bringing a wide range of perspectives to this conversation, ranging from the role of natural assets in managing risk to place-based approaches and the importance of collaboration, and the role and evolution of risk modeling in building infrastructure resilience. We're going to seek to understand how we can bring each of these pieces together to inform policy choices and empower the resilience decision-making process. We have 4 panelists who are all going to give us very brief, to the point presentations to set the context for our discussion. So before we dive into each of the 4 presentations, I'm going to take a moment to introduce all of our panelists. So first up, we'll have Roy Brooke. Roy is the Executive Director at the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative. Previously, Roy served as the Director of Sustainability for the City of Victoria. He's also previously held roles with the World Health Organization and several other positions within the United Nations. He was also formerly a political advisor to Canada's Environment Minister. Following Roy, we'll have Deborah Carlson. Deborah is a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law for the Green Communities Program. She works with communities in British Columbia to support land and water management that maintains and restores healthy connections to nature, including ecosystem-based measures to adapt to climate change. Next up, we'll have Mikhail Chester. Mikhail is the director of the Métis Center for Infrastructure and Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University, where he maintains a research program focused on preparing infrastructure and their institutions for the challenges of the coming century. And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from David Bristow. David is an assistant professor of civil engineering at the University of Victoria, where he runs the Cities and Infrastructure Systems Lab, and where he is a member of the Institute of Integrated Energy Systems. He teaches on infrastructure resilience and sustainability in civil engineering. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to our first presenter for the day, Roy Brooke.
So I'm going to take just 3 or 4 minutes, tell you what natural asset management is, why it matters, and how it links to a risk agenda. If you forget everything else that I say, you really only need to remember 2 things. First, natural assets such as wetlands, forests, green spaces, riparian areas are amongst our most valuable assets. They're central to any resilient infrastructure system. And second, by understanding, valuing, and managing natural assets as core infrastructure, local governments can deliver vital services that they would otherwise need to deliver via an engineered asset and deliver a range of co-benefits, including the risks related to an aging built engineered stock, as Kristy mentioned at the outset. So to expand on this a little bit, wetlands and forests, for example, can absorb stormwater. This can reduce flooding in place of engineered retention ponds and culverts. Naturalized foreshores and coastal floodplains can protect against sea level rise. Just a couple of examples. However, in Canada, most local governments do not conceptualize natural assets as delivering vital services, typically do not really know how much they depend on these assets or what it might cost to replace them if they were to become degraded. So just to summarize that, there's a gap between the potential of natural assets and how many, if not most, local governments act on that potential. And the gap matters for at least 3 reasons. First, local governments, pandemic or no pandemic, they have to deliver core services, vital services on the backs of an aging, engineered stock that is in need of renewal, in need of maintenance. Second, the status quo is not always delivering, and we only need to look no further than the most recent flood or combined sewer overflow to see evidence of this. And third, there's very few saviors. On the one hand, local governments are getting squeezed. They have to deliver or have to manage about 60% of the country's infrastructure. They collect 12 cents on the tax dollar. And on the other hand, they have to contend with more and crazier weather events that result from climate change. And so if you add all of this up, what it means is that if you have valuable assets for which you have paid no capital costs and that these deliver core services, you need to find ways to conceptualize them, understand them, value them, and manage them appropriately. So how do we do all this? Well, the good news in part is that Canadian municipalities are required to adopt modern structured asset management systems in Canada. And the core organizing principle of asset management is sustainable service delivery. This means that it doesn't really matter to a local government if it's an engineered or a green asset delivering the service. What matters is whether or not the service is cost-effective and reliable. There's growing evidence that this is the case, and that in fact that asset management is almost a made-to-order platform, really, for understanding, valuing, and managing natural assets in ways that preserve their ecological integrity and the services that they provide. And it's precisely this that MNAI, Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, the organization that I'm involved with, helps local governments to do. You can see some of the communities that we have or are working in. The town of Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast was the first mover. We're now working in 20, 30 plus communities. You'll see an announcement in the next week or so. That number is going to jump up quite a bit. The evidence base is very far from exhaustive, but it is getting compelling. Communities are finding that natural assets have high value, that they can be managed using traditional asset management tools, and that they provide services that meet or exceed standards, and of course, provide a host of other benefits. To summarize, I would say there's a number of different relationships to risk. At a very macro level, I would say the risk really is if we fail to act in the absence of perfect knowledge and data, allow natural assets to continue to be lost, continue to rely solely or almost exclusively on an aging engineered stock in the face of growing evidence that there are alternatives. And so to manage this risk, I think we need real targets and rapid scale up of options. At more of a program level, there's different types of risk. One is that most local governments simply don't know or understand the extent to which they are exposed if their natural assets were to become degraded. There's probably risks related to what kind of risks and liability they are communicating. And there's also a set of risks here in which we can no longer understand municipal service delivery in terms of past data and past trends. This means that going forward in the future, we need infrastructure solutions that are more resilient, more adaptable to risk to a changing environment. And natural assets can play an important role here too. MNAI, I wouldn't say we have a holistic risk framework yet or have a very holistic approach in terms of how we think about risk, but we're moving in that direction. It's very important. And that's probably my 3 minutes done.
And thank you for your presentation. And just a reminder to all our participants that you can pop your questions for Roy into the Q&A box anytime here. So with that, we'll pass it off to Deb.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to URBC for this opportunity to participate in the panel and to connect virtually with all of you today. I'm at home, like many of you perhaps, and I'm really grateful to live and work on the beautiful territories of the Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations. As I said, I'm a staff lawyer at West Coast Environmental Law, and we're a not-for-profit group that works on environmental law reform around the province of BC. And we try to ground our work in respect for each other and for the land and the water and the air and the landscapes where we all coexist. And part of this is, of course, respect for the Indigenous peoples that have lived in and managed their activities in these landscapes so successfully for time out of mind. And they've managed for abundance, and we still benefit everyone from that today. And we also acknowledge that their laws and practices are very much alive and real in these landscapes. So today I was going to focus on some work that we've done in relation to climate change adaptation, because that's where we mostly intersect with, well, I guess we intersect with infrastructure in a number of ways at West Coast, but that's one of the ways. And for us, climate change adaptation is interesting, particularly because of the way that adaptation and resilience can be connected to green and blue nature-based approaches to supporting human life in cities. And as you've already heard, cities are it's almost trite to say, I guess, are kind of on the front lines in climate change adaptation. They've been feeling the impacts directly, and also see lots of them on the horizon as well. So in our work, we talk about mainstreaming, about integration, about reconnecting to nature, holistic approaches. But what does it really mean? So I'm going to try and make that a little more concrete. So of course, urban areas, particularly in the Lower Mainland of BC, are facing a range of climate change impacts, but really something I think that particularly caught everyone's education was sea level rise, because it's a sort of new and different risk. And this is an image of Boundary Bay. There's a lot of very valuable intertidal habitat there, the marsh area. And of course, left on its own, this area could adapt. It would just start to migrate landward as sea levels rose. But as you can see from the graphic here, we have the phenomenon of what's often referred to as coastal squeeze, where if there's a hard barrier at the shoreline, that natural habitat can't migrate. And in fact, this area is protected by dikes. This is an aerial view of the same area, more or less, Boundary Bay. And then, as you see here, this is a line roughly where the dike runs around the bay. And in the Lower Mainland, we have about 125 kilometers of dikes. So lots of areas like this. But we've also already lost a lot of habitat in this area because of the urbanization and industrial development. 70 to 90% of our coastal wetlands, extremely valuable habitat, extremely important to protect what's left. So looking at this from a legal point of view, how do we move forward and kind of address this somehow? Well, we have a lot of guidelines and some regulation, but it's all really focused on the dikes. And going back to this photo here, this image you see, that's a very thin line. We're spending a lot of attention really just looking at this line. And further attention was focused just on this line shortly after the provincial government issued guidance about sea level rise. There was another study that said, well, we're going to need to spend $9.5 billion to upgrade dikes. So again, having a big conversation about dikes in the Lower Mainland. From an environmental perspective, this wasn't great. And we ended up talking and kind of working together with another organization in the Lower Mainland, the Lower Fraser Fisheries Alliance, which provides technical support to Indigenous nations in the Lower Fraser. And they were also really interested in thinking about how we could have a slightly different conversation and think about protecting some of this habitat, because they're interested in protecting fish habitat. Prior to that, we ended up having a conversation as well with the city of Surrey, which is mainly on the right side of this image. And they have a neighborhood there that you can see that kind of loops out into the bay called Crescent Beach, which is obviously going to be very vulnerable to any changes in sea level rise. And working with Deb Harford and the Adaptation to Climate Change team at Simon Fraser University, we had a series of workshops with community members there. And it was really interesting to spend some time with the community members and try to understand what it was that made their community so valuable to them. And then to think about, given what is so valuable to them about being in their community, how would they see the future if they know that sea level rise is going to be a big problem that has to be managed. And I'm hoping to hear some more thoughts and reflections from all of you on this today, but I want to share with you a very rough graphic that I tried to make to kind of summarize some reflections on this engagement process and where it took us. So what we really found was, there were these shared values at the center, and then surrounding that are the relationships that we all have as well. And then, there's a bunch of activities that we carry on. And then we have infrastructure, but infrastructure really just kind of is ultimately, when you think about it in this context, it's sort of mediating our relationships with the places that we live. So it is this thin area of mediation. And I made that a dotted line because I just wanted to emphasize that this is, it isn't a barrier, and we can have relationships with nature that go directly out to the places where we are, but that many of our relationships, even with nature and with each other, are sort of, mediated through infrastructure. So what were the kind of key takeaways from this? Well, first off was that we do share these values in communities. And I think something in just the political climate, it's important to reflect on that there's a lot that we share. And that we also really value these relationships with each other and really our relationships with nature, no matter where we are. And if we want to think about resilience, we need to think about, grounding it in our values and in our relationships. So we need to, remind ourselves always that this is like what's important in these conversations and what are we trying to protect? Are we trying to have resilient infrastructure, or are we trying to have resilient communities? So when we think about how to approach this, how do we move forward? And from a legal perspective, we are really pushed towards looking at the infrastructure and meeting the standards, which is fair because safety obviously is one of our values, but it's just one of the values that we have. So we need to, I think, always kind of try and remember that infrastructure helps mediate these relationships we have with the places where we are, but it can't really deny those relationships. If we just think about an example of dikes, about building really high dikes, we just put ourselves at risk of those dikes having catastrophic failures. We need to always maintain the relationships that we have with nature. And so as a different approach to this, we're involved with the City of Surrey, State of Delta, Semiahmoo First Nation, and what's now the Emergency Planning Secretariat in supporting a roundtable process for policymakers, rights holders in the Boundary Bay area that is supporting a project to pilot ways to enhance the salt marsh in Boundary Bay to maintain its ecosystem function, but at the same time to gain the benefits of flood regulation that it's already providing and can provide well into the future if we give it a little bit of help. So it's building a stronger relationship with that salt marsh. And I think I probably used my 3 minutes. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Deborah. So we'll jump right into our next presentation from Mikhail.
All right, greetings, folks. Mikhail Chester, I'm a faculty member in Civil, Environmental, and Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University, and had the pleasure of visiting BC in March, right before the pandemic hit. So it was the last flight I took. Connected with a number of folks here, so I'm happy to be talking to you about the concept of infrastructure in the Anthropocene. So when I talk about infrastructure, I fully recognize that infrastructure means many different things. There's lots of right ways to frame what infrastructure means. Generally, when I refer to it, I am referring to kind of engineered built systems that deliver basic and critical services like water, power, mobility, information and communication technologies, and so on. Not just the physical assets, but also the governance of those systems. I think you have to think about both dimensions as well as how we educate. I'll leave that for another day. The general idea that I want to explore here, or kind of give you guys my insights into, or thinking on at least, is that the world is moving faster and faster. The world is becoming more and more uncertain. The world is becoming more and more volatile. There's hard evidence to back that up. You can say the world has always been changing. Indeed, it has, but not at the rate that we've seen in the past 50 years. And when you talk about something like climate change and the word non-stationarity comes up, right? The past, you might argue, is no longer, in many domains, a reasonable predictor of the future. So why does that matter? Well, if you've got this world that's changing rapidly, and you've got these infrastructure systems that are intentionally designed to be slow, to be rigid, to ossify, right? You put them in and then you connect a bunch of things to them, you add on to them, you make them very, very difficult to change, right? Well, those two trajectories are going in the wrong direction, right? A rapidly changing world and rigid, slow moving infrastructure. And that is the fundamental concept that I have been exploring lately with a number of folks in what I loosely describe as infrastructure in the Anthropocene. So what am I talking about? Well, technologies, right? Cyber technologies and otherwise, electric vehicles, rooftop solar, smart this, that, and the other are moving faster and faster and faster, right? We're seeing that sort of integration in infrastructure in ways that we have never seen before, right? Our dumb legacy systems are quickly meeting new technologies, and those new technologies are often driven by two things: information and communications, right? So it's not just generating information with sensors or people's phones, but it's also transmitting that information to people, to users, to agencies, to whomever to make sense of it. Financing. So, the idea of rehabilitating infrastructure was brought up. Financing, it appears to be in this state where, it's kind of difficult to know where the next buck is going to come from to finance, infrastructure that was largely built for our grandparents and has reached the end of its useful life, and we're band-aiding it over and over and over again. And, just getting it up to what we need today is one thing, but radically redesigning it for the future is another thing. Social and cultural change. So, I like to point out that my 3-year-old is able to say to the Google device, play me a song, and he's basically in 10 seconds able to hear any song that's ever been created in the history of humanity, so to speak, right? How young people interface or expect services is radically different than how my generation or older generations may have requested or experienced it, right? Cyber technologies. So I mentioned technology in general, right? But we can think about cyber technology. So in particular, this notion that infrastructure are in many ways becoming connected to the broader world, and that creates wonderful new opportunities and efficiencies, as well as vulnerabilities, right? So we can think about asymmetric warfare and whole society conflict where, if you think the next war is going to be, two armies lining themselves up on a battlefield pointing guns at each other, right? You're probably mistaken. It's more likely going to look like one country holding another's infrastructure hostage until the other one, gives into particular sets of demand, and then that first country sort of making it unclear as to who's doing what. Climate change, I think we talk about that extensively, right? So you could talk about this decoupling concept when you think about climate change, climate effects, whether it's heat, precip, drought, is now sort of changing in ways that are somewhat unpredictable and sort of highly uncertain, right? So we can't look at historical stream gauge data and say necessarily that it's a reasonable predictor of the future. So how do we design infrastructure if you have all of this uncertainty, right? When the models that we use for designing infrastructure are largely rooted in certainty, right? Do we just make things bigger? Well, you can do that up to a certain extent, but there's sort of a threshold in terms of how much you can do. And then, of course, increasing ideological polarization. Look no further than the United States, but infrastructure is held hostage by this and many of these other trends. So again, you need to recognize, or I think we need to recognize, that there is this decoupling happening. And does that mean that infrastructure are becoming obsolete? To some extent, in some ways, yes. But in totality, no. What you're actually seeing is more likely a distribution of power and authority and control across those systems. Case in point, Google controls the temperature in my home, right, through a smart thermostat, and software that uses artificial intelligence decides what temperature should be like in my house, right? So now the energy system has a new player, which is Google, just like Tesla and electric car companies are players in the transportation system right now. So you have this sort of distribution of control, and that has profound implications. So what do we do? How do we think about infrastructure going forward? I don't have the solutions. Maybe one day I will, but I would argue that there are some basic design tenets that I think we should think about and maybe start to implement in practice. One is agility and flexibility. So if infrastructure is moving slowly, the world is moving faster and faster, let's make our infrastructure more agile and flexible instead of rigid. There's a number of ways we can do that in terms of the technologies that are used, adaptive management practices, and so on. Design for complexity. Complexity is the idea that we don't know what our systems do. We can hold a hurricane over New York City and we know bad things will happen, but we don't know precisely what, right? So how we design and plan for surprise is particularly important. We generally don't do that very well. If you're not thinking about information and cybersecurity as you think about infrastructure, then you are quickly making your systems obsolete. So in any thinking about infrastructure going forward, you have to think about information. You have to think about cybersecurity. You have to think about who controls that information, right? Who can make sense of that information. It might be a foreign adversary. It might be the infrastructure operator. It might be an app developer in Silicon Valley, right? It could be all of those. Design for extremes and failure, right? Think about climate change, think about extreme events, and sometimes they get worse in some climate forecasts, sometimes they get better. This single narrative that climate extremes get worse everywhere is simply not true. And that feeds into the complexity of how we make decisions. If I showed you a map of precipitation changes in California, for example, extreme precip into the future, in some places in the state, it gets worse. In some places, it gets milder, those extremes. That's actually part of the challenge here, right? In terms of how we prioritize the scarce resources that we have. And lastly, think about infrastructure as knowledge enterprises, not an amalgamation of hardware. Think about infrastructure as systems that make sense of the environments in which they operate, not simply climate and weather, but demand, technology, culture, politics, and so on. It's how these systems generate knowledge. They certainly generate knowledge today, but they probably have to generate different types of knowledge into the future. And the way that they make sense of what's going on becomes particularly important. So I will leave you with this thought and question. If you were to redesign your institution for the challenges of 2100, what would the governance or bureaucratic structure of that institution look like? And if the answer is, it wouldn't look like the bureaucratic structure that we have today, then you should think about what it means to transition to the needs of not just today, but the next 100 years. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. So we're on to our last presentation before we move into the Q&A. So David, I will hand it to you now.
Thank you. All right, so a lot of participants in the chat today have talked about issues around data. There's also been a number of other themes that I think I'll pick up on in my talk right now. But I think the part of the way to look at why some of these emerging themes have become so important is to look through history. So with that in mind, we could ask, well, how might we summarize how our disaster risk has changed over the course of the Anthropocene? From an engineering perspective, our assets have been designed to resist breaking at increasingly higher stresses. That has challenges moving forward, and it's also not the whole picture of how disaster risk has changed. For instance, when the Cascadia earthquake struck in 1700, we're aware that it completely eradicated an entire village on Vancouver Island, and the resulting tsunami was felt across the sea in Japan. But the advancements that were made in Japan when their major earthquake struck in 2011 and the resulting tsunami, the picture wasn't just, well, everything's harder and stronger, and so we're more well protected. Vehicles collided into things, some structures collapsed, and a power plant released radiation that ended up being detected all the way back on Vancouver Island. And there are a number of other examples of how engineering has altered disaster risk. And the emerging picture is that changes in our engineering have not stopped things from breaking. They have reduced death that probably would have occurred in a lot of instances, but rather how our engineering has evolved has changed how things break and what the impacts are. Another reason disaster risk is different today, and this has been alluded to by my other panelists, is due to our size. Population and income growth have accelerated tremendously since 1700. And as a species, we've never had so much to lose. And we've never had so much change in how much there is to lose from second to second. And another major driver of disaster risk today is, of course, that the hazards are changing, but also because society and the technology that supports society are also changing. Climate hazards are discussed widely these days, but the major change in society and technology's influence on disaster risk is mentioned somewhat less. I think most people attending today are aware of these changes, but a big part of that change is the networked nature of our modern society. Not only that we have just one type of network, we have multiple interacting and overlaid networks, and multiple types of hazards can cause similar impacts to these networks. So today, addressing disaster risk means addressing risk in networks of networks. And here are some of the things that we can do to address this. One, we should assess and model against multiple extreme hazards to show the wider benefits of reducing risk together. Two, we should look and model with an outward focus when assessing rare events and ask, whose networks can I really depend on? Who is really depending on my networks? And three, we should coordinate investment in networks and restoration plans across sectors and with emergency management and communities for a whole of society risk reduction. Increasingly, I would say these are not just opportunities, but these need to be requirements moving forward. I think this relates to Mike's mention of this question about governance and bureaucratic structures. Our models, our decisions, and our risk reduction cannot go much further without significant progress on these three items. For instance, I'm part of the Pathways project that's been a theme in URBC this year. And that project is making great efforts to try and bring data sharing forward. And we need much more of that to accompany the changes you see on the screen here. So thank you very much.
Thanks, David. All right, so for the final segment of today's session, we're going to move into some Q&A. So just a reminder, you can type your questions into the Q&A box and you may upvote one another's questions if there's one you're particularly interested in. But to kick things off, I'd like to circle back to Roy's presentation. So you made a really strong case that natural assets are amongst our most valuable assets in managing risk and in providing core services, and are really central to our resilient infrastructure systems. So with that in mind, we've seen a lot of improvements in recent years, but there still seem to be some challenges in funding and financing for natural assets. Would you say there are still barriers, or what are the opportunities that we could focus on here? Great
question. I've got, I guess, four thoughts on this. One, in terms of funding, we're certainly seeing significant improvements. For example, the Federal Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund is funding natural assets, does consider natural assets to be core infrastructure, and is thus even ahead of where the Public Sector Accounting Board is in its treatment of what is and is not an asset. But there's still lots of challenges, and probably first amongst them is a cultural challenge. Like, people might not be willing to put forward for a funding program a natural asset because there can be real or perceived, and increasingly perceived rather than real, challenges just getting people to say that, you know what, nature is in fact an asset. It can in fact deliver service. So there's lots of ways around that, which I don't have time to get into. But the second, with respect to financing, sure, there's definitely more financing out there. We've seen a few bond issues in Canada. I think it was the Netherlands had a large sovereign bond, a lot of which went into green infrastructure. However, if you look at total bond disbursements, green bond disbursements, a very small fragment of these goes to anything resembling green or natural assets. And there's a bunch of reasons, probably conceptualization, data. We're doing a lot of work in this area. So, there's progress, but it's in its infancy. A third thing, there's a very interesting project that we're involved in together with Swiss Re and Insurance Bureau of Canada. Basically, what it could end up in is insurance for local governments, parametric insurance that's triggered by a specific event. And instead of just repairing buildings and fixing power lines and stuff, you're actually putting money into repairing and rehabilitating and managing natural assets that reduce risk in the first place. So there's only 2 examples of that kind of insurance anywhere in the world. So if we can get it right, it could be very exciting. My final comment is really, it's not just about money. Like, sure, it's always going to be important to rehabilitate and to restore natural assets, but it's probably far more important to not destroy them in the first place, to understand their value, and through proper planning, zoning, valuation, to consider them in the first instance, because if you just focus on repairing them after the fact, we're never going to hit any of our biodiversity targets or anything else, just because it takes so long for a repaired asset to start performing as an intact one might be. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks, Roy. A lot of great points there, but certainly an important theme I'm seeing emerging from some of our presentations and from what you've said is sort of the way we define infrastructure. There needs to be a bit of a cultural shift there to really broaden our definition and our understanding of what infrastructure is and sort of what it means to our communities. And so a question for Deb next. We know that our communities depend on all types of infrastructure, and that I love the phrase you used as infrastructure as an effective mediator of a relationship with the land and with each other. So with that in mind, do you think that we have realistic expectations about what infrastructure can provide in our communities, for example, level of service or otherwise?
I guess I'd really like to hear others' perspectives on this, but I mean, I think the question is really starting to emerge when we think about the Lower Mainland and some of the places where we have, expanded greatly into the floodplain in terms of development. And is it really viable to provide perfect flood protection for life in a floodplain? Can you really eliminate flood risk effectively? And is that a desirable goal for people living in a floodplain over the longer term? And how do we engage in that kind of conversation when, it's, first of all, it's a frightening conversation to have for many people. It's distressing in terms of property values, et cetera. But how can we get beyond that and really think about what's realistic in terms of infrastructure? And I was wondering if I could just add a little bit to the previous question. It's sort of related. Like, if we think about doing things differently and thinking about approaches like more nature-based approaches, Roy's really ably highlighted some of the challenges with that. And I just would maybe add to that, based on the experience of the disaster mitigation adaptation funding that City of Surrey has received. And City of Surrey has shown huge leadership, I think, in taking on a project like Living Dike, like enhancing the salt marsh. But the way infrastructure funding is structured, it's based on building a great big thing and then sort of, minimal maintenance over time to that thing, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to experiment with nature-based approaches, and also thinking about how they need sustainable funding over time, maybe not so much outlay up front, but then, sustained funding to carry it through. So it's another way in which it kind of prevents us from thinking about things differently over that long term, as was mentioned in one of the other presentations as well, and being more agile.
Next question I'll direct towards Mikhail. So you talked about the fact that the past is no longer a reasonable indicator of the future. Given the rapid change that is occurring and sort of the legacy of infrastructure that is slow and very static and difficult to change, and indeed is sort of becoming obsolete. what would you suggest is the main takeaway regarding how we build, design, manage, and govern infrastructure, and as you call it, the age of the Anthropocene?
There's no easy answer here. I think there's lots and lots to start chipping away at, right? So the first question is, how are our systems governed? What are the bureaucratic forms of our infrastructure agencies? Do they reflect that of the industrial era? As divisions that silo knowledge and expertise and resources, yet try to respond to problems that are multi-silo, multi-divisional, multi-domain, right? So that seems to not work. Probably want to shift that. How do we educate? So I can self-criticize as an academic and instructor. What are we teaching? What are we teaching our students? So for those who are out there who are hiring students from local universities or nearby universities, start talking to those universities and saying, this is what we need. These are the types of problems we're facing. They're kind of different than 30 years ago. Start training folks for that. And then of course the technologies themselves. Sure, you need pipes underground for water and power lines up above, and maybe asphalt for roads, maybe, but can we start implementing maybe dynamic adaptive planning? So some portion of the asset is rigid, but some portion we leave as flexible. We say to ourselves, look, we're not going to over design this thing with, hubris that, it's going to be fine for the next 40 years. No, we're going to design it for 10 and commit to coming back to it and looking, reassessing, taking the newest 10 years of knowledge and saying, what do we do now? Do we leave it alone or do we change it? Right. So there's lots to start doing.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, you're certainly raising lots of new questions as well. How do we start to sort of adapt and change the way that we actually implement infrastructure, and even going back to the education of our professionals who are designing and building infrastructure. So I appreciate that perspective. And David, I wanted to circle back to your presentation now. You made a really interesting case that we're able to reduce disaster risk through improved management of our risks, in some cases due to infrastructure, but also highlighted that we're living in sort of a more complex world than ever. And so while there may be some reduction in risk because of things we've learned from past disasters, we've got more to lose than we ever have before, I believe is what you said. So how can we change the incentives for owners and managers of critical infrastructure to assess risks and interdependencies such that they and we are managing systemic risks more effectively and will help to enhance our recovery profiles?
Thanks, Kristy. I think it begins with really understanding why doing this is so critical if you really want to reduce disaster risk. So the challenge is that with low probability events, in these events, each sector's remaining risk, the risk that they haven't addressed, these are all realized simultaneously. And even if, the reliability index that each sector is using, each one shows they're 99.999% reliable, it's in those low probability events where they're all simultaneously affected. Those risks spill over across sectors and sort of driving this creation of the disaster. So it's then in particular when interdependency risk really becomes a big concern. It's not the only time, but it's the major time. It's also then when emergency management becomes extremely important. But has emergency management been able to be part of all of the decisions about the infrastructure? So any incentives then need to be designed to specifically target addressing these shared risks in these low probability events. It needs to focus on requiring, multi-sector joined up action, focusing on multiple hazards so we can assess the full benefit of any actions that we might take. And quite importantly, it needs to be very geared towards involving the communities and understanding why these issues are so critical to communities and what the particular unique needs of an individual community might be.
Great, thank you, David. So I think we'll move to a question from the audience now. I have a question from Jesse Neary, which is, what arena for engaging the parties do we have available for creating adaptive infrastructure, and who would we locally involve? I think there may have been some thoughts exchanged in the chat already, but Roy, perhaps I could look to you to start us off on that question, and anyone please feel free to add.
So we obviously have a particular slice related to natural assets. What we are typically working with the same line departments in any local government that would be involved in normal asset management for engineered assets, which is inherently a sort of a transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary process. So if the question relates to natural assets and local governments, then that is then that is a starting point. There is a very clear role for community and civil society organizations from a multitude of perspectives. Data, social license, local expertise, just to name a few. The other thing that I just didn't have time to get into in the presentation is this. There is no local government really in this country that is relying on services from natural assets that they own or have jurisdiction over in their entirety. And so to give one local example, on Vancouver Island, the Comox Valley Regional District, they have to provide drinking water to 49,000 people. Where does the water come from? It comes from the watershed. Who owns the watershed? Not the CVRD. They don't have 1 square centimeter. And so there, it's a multi-use, multi-owner, multi-jurisdiction watershed. And there's a multitude of players involved in it. So, it's going to be contextual, but where natural assets are concerned, it's going to be local government, civil society, it's going to be the asset management teams, and, whoever else has ownership and jurisdiction in that particular area.
So this is a question for our civils profs. Do you see climate considerations being integrated in international model codes anytime in the future? What are the requirements relating to resiliency you're seeing being required by public and social infrastructure owners and managers?
I'm an optimist, so the answer is sure. I see some signs of both of those things. So first, for example, the American Society of Civil Engineers, that I'm familiar with, has recently published guidelines on how to think about climate uncertainty and infrastructure design. And that's actually quite important. One, because it's a major professional society. Two, it's the largest international civil engineering society in the world. It has a huge international presence in addition to the Americans. So yes, you do see it emerging. There's the point was brought up earlier, and I think it was Roy or maybe Deb who brought it up. But cities, it sounds cliche at this point, but it remains very true. Cities tend to be the innovators in how we are doing and thinking about resilience, and that seems to be the case across the world. Cities are the ones where we tend to see in the U.S. the most significant efforts around incorporating resilience. It takes on lots of different forms. It tends to focus on, or cities tend to focus on robustness. This is Europe and the United States, meaning let's harden, strengthen, armor, make things tougher, hold back, continue to control the environment. Why are we doing that? Because that's what we know how to do. But we're starting to see that shell crack. We're starting to see more innovative ways of thinking about resilience. Yes, there's a million studies out there on resilience metrics. I think they are valuable to some extent, but we're starting to see more critical examination of what resilience means as it relates to infrastructure beyond robustness. So you're starting to see the concept of extensibility emerge, right? So what happens at the design envelope of a system, right? We could talk about this with human engineered systems. As you approach the design envelope, do you just throw your hands up and say, oh, it's gonna fail? The emergency management agency now comes in, or do capabilities of different shades emerge, or different types emerge, right? Where, okay, the water distribution system might fail, let's truck water in, for example. Or the power system's about to go offline, let's kick up those distributed generators, right? Something like that, the microgrids, right? So we're starting to see resilience through this concept of extensibility and sustained adaptability emerge. This idea that simply the design envelope will have to continuously change into the future, right? We can't just set it once and leave it for 50 years. We probably have to continue to change it. So, I would say those two things are hopeful as far as I'm concerned.
David, do you, as our other civils prof, like to add anything to that?
Sure. I think Mike's answer there touched on a lot of great points. I guess I'll just add a couple thoughts. So I think in terms of requirements relating to resiliency, I think there's a big range here, at least in the Canadian context, what I've seen. Obviously, the PIBC protocol. So this is the Public Infrastructure Engineering Vulnerability Committee protocol. It's been applied in this is a mechanism for including climate resilience within your sort of engineering assessments or your asset management planning. And we've seen it applied in a number of places across Canada. There's some governance changes that have been going on with how the protocol is managed of late. But I think that's been a really strong push in terms of considering, collective knowledge and experience and expertise and the uncertainties associated with climate change in choices about when to upgrade and how much to upgrade by. I think one of the key things to keep in mind there is that dependency risk is a huge element of any climate change resiliency or climate change vulnerability that you may have. And so bringing that into a PIBC assessment or similar assessments is really critical. When it comes to sort of other requirements, so I do a lot of work sort of at the interface between, what's going to happen to communities because of what's happening to the infrastructure. So, I interface with emergency managers and other stakeholders related to sort of disaster situations. So I wouldn't call these things requirements, but some of the common things that I'm seeing that these other stakeholders are really keen to know about their infrastructure is what can I likely depend upon? What is the potential distribution of damage? And most critically, what are you going to repair first? Where might I need to dispatch aid the most? This question about the recovery side, I think is one that keeps cropping up, and that there isn't a lot of great insight yet to be shared, partly because every disaster is going to be a little bit different. There's a lot of uncertainty in what's going to happen after the fact, but getting some insight on how things will be prioritized, what might be repaired, I think will really help the other stakeholders who are going to be critical to dealing with and managing disasters.
I'd kind of like to stitch together two ideas. We're talking the last two questions, one focused on arenas for getting involved in these kinds of activities. The last question focused on sort of codes and protocols. And I wanted to offer the following idea. If we say that it is a useful thing for natural assets to be understood, valued, and managed properly, if we say that it's a good thing that we should no longer just sort of give them an implicit value of zero in all decision making, then we must have not only the kind of operational level work that I was describing in my first 3 minutes, but we must also have an overarching body of norms and standards, I'm using those terms loosely, so that we know that the work is being done effectively, comparably, and replicably. So, we need a range of different types of norms and standards. There's a number of different efforts already underway to this end, and I'll just cite one example. The engineers and geoscientists of BC are developing a standard a professional practice guideline on asset management, which will have as an integral component consideration of natural assets. To my knowledge, that'll be the first anywhere. We're working with them on this. And I cite this as an example of another area in which people can get involved in efforts to develop resilient infrastructure. And in the example I'm giving, this is in fact all about, norm, standards, codes, and protocols.
Thank you, Roy. So we'll have time for one last question from the audience, maybe two. We'll see how it goes. But why don't we start with Deb on this one? Deb, how do you think the prioritization and categorization of critical infrastructure in disaster management and emergency preparedness by governments impacts whether we are in fact investing in resilient infrastructure? And second part to that question is, resilient infrastructure also needs to include social and environmental infrastructure. Do we consider these as critical, and how might we make this happen? So pick and choose parts of that question you'd like to address.
Okay, there's a lot there. Yeah, just first off, I think in terms of defining critical infrastructure, I think it's a deficiency in the generally understood definition of that term, that it doesn't include natural infrastructure usually. And that's something that my colleague Andrew Gage, I think, has even written about in the past. And so I think we want to be clear about what's critical for survival. And as I suggested earlier, I really see the built infrastructure as kind of a mediating piece, whereas what is really critical is nature itself. That's what we really can't survive without. So partly trying to shift the perspective on that. In terms of prioritization, I alluded to this a little bit in my talk, but the way the existing regulation in BC is set up, it focuses our attention on certain pieces of infrastructure and maintaining those. For example, the dikes are one case, although even in that case, our dikes are, as we've learned over the past couple of years, not necessarily up to the standard to protect us from existing risks. But really, you do get your attention focused on this thin band. And then it's local governments that kind of end up having to backstop this by developing their own processes to think about what's good for their communities and what will make their communities ultimately livable. And so we have some really great examples of cities and towns in BC showing leadership on this. I already spoke about the city of Surrey and of course, city of Vancouver. Both those are highly resourced urban areas, but over on the island, places like Campbell River, for example, has been very ambitious in developing climate adaptation strategies. Some of the cities in the interior, in the Kootenays, have also really moved forward with that, but kind of it's almost feels like it's an antidote to the regulatory framework that they work in. And Professor Chester was talking about needs for new governance arrangements. And I feel like the cities and towns are kind of exploring that through their processes of looking at climate change risks with their communities and thinking about where they want to go on that.
Thanks, Deb. Mikhail, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, in the engineered infrastructure side of things, I know it's true in the US, and I would venture to say it's true in Canada as well, that criticality, or how we think about criticality, largely results from kind of military framings of that term around infrastructure going back about 100 years, right? So, water and power and roads are critical infrastructure, of course, but COVID has shown us how problematic a singular framing of criticality is, right? So, COVID hits and water and power and roads are largely intact, but all of a sudden we as a society or societies need something very different, right? All of a sudden we see in the United States that, we can't open homeless shelters indoors because the virus will spread, and parks, now become extremely critical to our public health response, right? So, the concept of multi-hazard thinking was brought up earlier, and, I think it's time for multi-hazard thinking when it comes to how we frame criticality in our ability to pivot. And I don't just mean that within the engineered systems domains of critical infrastructure, but absolutely incorporating ecosystem services, ecosystem function, and so on.
Thanks, Mikhail. So we've got about 5 minutes before we're going to wrap up for the day. So I think we'll just do one more question here. Let's start with Roy. At what scale is nature-based infrastructure being implemented in BC, and what is needed to accelerate the uptake of this type of infrastructure in the short term?
Oh, I was just busy typing an answer to that. Okay, so the scale, we used to work primarily at a sub-watershed level. We've really shifted to working at a watershed level. It's the unit at which this makes sense. It's really the only unit watershed or larger. Natural assets don't respect our jurisdictional or ownership boundaries, so we kind of have to think at that level. But that does, of course, make it inherently a bit more complex, because all of a sudden then you're dealing with multiple users and rights holders. In terms of how to accelerate it, I have a bunch of ideas, but I'll offer only one of them, and it's the following. So asset management, it's a whole sort of cycle of work. The most important first step is to do an inventory of a community's natural assets. It's not the same as a full project. It's not going to give you the valuations and all that. But without the inventory, you can't do anything else. And the inventories are, relatively speaking, not rocket science, not that expensive. And maybe I'll frame it as a rhetorical question. Why, as a community, would you not want to know what natural assets you own, what condition they are in, and what risks do they face? This is something that all communities, I believe anyway, should know. And as a small plug, we will be able to subsidize the undertaking of inventories in all great likelihood. Just watch our website, but we should have funding to announce in the next week or so to do quite a number of them across Canada. I mean, we're not the only way to do them, obviously, but yeah. So I would say go out and do inventories as a first step to acceleration.
Fantastic. We have about 2 minutes before we're going to move to our closing remarks. Does any of our panelists have burning last thoughts they'd like to share before we close out for today? Deb.
I have a question for you, and for anyone else who knows anything about and would like to say anything about the Envision rating system for sustainable infrastructure. Yes, just given the context here, we've been talking about standards and protocols. And I don't know how people in BC, how many people are familiar with that. I've only just heard of it myself. But
it's quite well known in the civil engineering community, particularly by the championed by the American Society of Civil Engineers, again, largest professional engineering society in the world. In general, I support the idea, right? So it's getting people to think about sustainability, to incorporate it into their projects. It's giving them guidance in how to do it. But we have to recognize what it is and what it isn't, as with all rating systems or these sorts of tools, right? So, one, you have to be careful, because anytime you have a tool that emphasizes points, people tend to focus on gaming points, like LEED. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to recognize that dynamic emerges in human behavior. The other is that these sorts of tools naturally reduce the complexity of the problems at hand, because they're complex problems, right? And if you tried to make them as complex as they are, you wouldn't be able to have a tool that is generally available and consumable by the masses. So, that being said, I think that there is a time and a place for Envision. If you're sort of on the ground and saying, I don't know what to do to improve the sustainability of my project, help, right? There is help. But if you think it's going to help us meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is not, right? Because those are like provide affordable, clean access to water for everybody in the world by a certain year, right? Envision is not for that.
Yeah, I've personally used Envision a little bit, and I find there is a lot of value in it providing a common lexicon when it comes to sustainability, and also presenting a pretty wide spectrum of sustainability indicators. For people who might not be thinking about sustainability and what sustainable infrastructure means, I think it's a really valuable tool and provides a strong foundation. But like you said, there are limitations and challenges in applying it. But we'll leave it at that. We're just about right on time here. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, both for your presentations and for taking the time to talk through this Q&A with us. Really appreciate you sharing your perspectives. And I'll just pass it off to Jessica to close us out.
Thank you, Kristy. Thank you so much for moderating and leading us through the session. Instead of providing physical gifts to our speakers, the URBC Organizing Committee has made a donation to the organization called Preparing Our Home. So in your honor, this donation is made, and it's a First Nations youth organization supporting them to be emergency management leaders in their community. So on behalf of our committee, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time and providing your input for this panel today. And I think that's it for us. I think we'll sign off, and thank you again to all the panelists and Kristy, our moderator.